Wherever you are in the world right now, welcome to Global Radio Ideas Webinar number 6. Aloha. I am in Hawaii today. I know, lucky me. I'm Ken Benson from the P1 Media Group. Our company provides research and consulting to radio stations around the world. Our co-host is back today, Andy, the CEO of Benztown.
Hey, guys.
Benztown's a worldwide leader in radio imaging and audio production with headquarters in Los Angeles and Germany. And we're so glad you joined us for today's Global Radio Ideas number 6, what listeners want tomorrow. And today, during the webinar, we're going to get a glimpse into our future with a stellar guest. And Andy will introduce him in just a second. Want to remind you guys, the chat box is activated. Give us a shout out. Let us know where you're watching. And our guest will also be taking your questions for around the last 10 minutes of today's webinar. So don't be shy and ask away. He's got a lot of great things to share. And Andy, before I throw it to you, just want to say hi to a few people that have joined in. A few more from the UK. Also, Alina from Bucharest, Romania. Great to have you on the webinar.
And our guest today, and lucky me, I don't have to be in Hawaii like Ken, so I'll have to sit here in like sunny and beautiful Stuttgart in a cold autumn evening. So our guest today is, there's so many things to say. I'll try to make this short. He's a seasoned radio executive who has worked all across the UK in any format you can imagine. He's an award-winning broadcaster and has worked as a presenter, programmer, general manager, and I think also as an owner. He has a great passion for radio history. Today, he consults in multiple markets. He has his own podcast called Radio Moments Conversations. Definitely worth checking out. He speaks to UK radio people who make and made a big difference. And he's written 2 must-read books, How to Make Great Radio and his latest Radio Secrets, an insider's guide to presenting and producing powerful content for broadcast and podcast. So that's going to be a big part of this conversation today. From the city of Nottingham, England, the city that made famous by Robin Hood, please welcome the radio version of Robin Hood, David Lloyd.
Thank you.
Hey, David.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Andy.
David, thanks for joining us today. We like to typically begin our webinars with asking somebody or asking our guests to share a story, something we may not know about them or something really interesting. But I don't want to waste time with you today because I really think you have such a great sense about not only where radio is today, but where it's going. So we're going to begin by asking you instead to make a bold prediction. What is radio in 2025?
Wow. These sessions are really good for the ego. Thank you very much for the generous interaction. So radio in 2025. As you said earlier on, I'm a bit of a historian, as well as being very enthusiastic about the future of radio and audio. I love radio history as well. And for me, there have sort of been 3 ages of radio. The first one started 100 years ago. Radio was invented, the early radio programs back in the 1920s. And then, of course, in the 50s, we had the rise of television. And that was a moment for radio. And there were quite a few people who thought, hang on, now we've got radio with pictures. Who wants to bother with radio? So, radio had to reinvent itself in the 1950s. And then, of course, we lost the quizzes to a large extent, the quiz programs, the dramas, they went to television, and radio reinvented itself with top 40 formats, and it came alive again, and of course has enjoyed an incredible history over the last few decades. And now we come to today, and here we are again. This is disruption and some more, isn't it? I believe we are at a crossroads in our medium at the moment, and the future will be very different from the past. This is the second great moment in radio's history. And, you can either get very depressed about that. If you expect radio to be the way it's always been, well, prepare for a very despondent few years. It's not going to be like that. It's all going to be a very different world. There is going to be less linear listening. I think if you look forward, you say 2025, if you look forward 5 years, more people listening to radio when they want it. It seems bizarre, doesn't it? The only reason radio has been live is because that was the only way of disseminating it. But why should people listen to programs when we want them to rather than when they want them to? So I think there's going to be a trend to less linear listening. But let me put a caution on that. By 2025, the bulk is still going to be live. But I think non-linear is going to grow. We're going to have new players, we're going to have new competition, and many of the names maybe putting their toes in the radio and audio world will be people who are not currently doing radio or audio. So some new players there. In transmission, we're going to have a mixed ecology. I mean, we've always had that, haven't we? From AM to FM, FM to DAB, certainly in the UK. And we're obviously more and more people now listening online. And that is going to grow hugely in the next 5 years. But again, a note of caution. I think that there's a danger that those of us who work in media feel that the amount of online listening currently is way ahead of what the reality is. So it's growing quickly, but still at the moment, it's not as big as some people would say. The dashboard, where are we going to be with that? You know, we were talking, weren't we, a few years ago about the battle for the dashboard, and when car radios aren't there anymore and people getting their music from other places. And just as that was about to take a turn, suddenly comes voice command. And I think that's going to be the in-car space, just as it will be in the home, in terms of in 5 years' time, people will shout out for the biggest brands, the biggest personalities in radio. And I think I'll just finish, this is a very long prediction, isn't it? I'll just finish by saying that I think in 5 years' time, that relationship that people have with radio will change. We're already seeing the relationship 15 to 24s have with radio is different from we baby boomers. And I think that's going to creep up into the 25, 34s in the next 5 years. So there's going to be a different relationship. It's not better. It's not worse. They're listening to different things. It's just different. So that's the way, I was going to say in a nutshell, but that was a hefty nutshell, wasn't it? Just a few words about 2025.
Wow.
So David, let me just do a quick follow-up. Obviously, a big concern, I think, for everyone around the world is 1524s, which will soon be 2534s. What, if anything, can we do about that?
They're just behaving differently, aren't they? We need to the objective of all great radio programming is work out who your audience are, what habits do they have. So we need to understand those. But, I think sometimes trying to tackle those generations with the tactics of yesteryear won't work. No. And we need to start afresh. They'll be consuming different things in different ways. And we're going to talk a bit later on, aren't we, about the competition against streaming and everything else. But I think we just have to accept that they've got incredibly busy lives. They will find exactly what they want. They will find who supplies it, and they'll want it when they want it. And we've got to adapt to that, the way those brains work, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and we see this on-demand consumption already. I mean, with TV, right? I mean, think about how Netflix and Amazon Prime and all these services have changed the landscape there. So new ownership structures in the UK for the last year. So what's happening in UK radio overall on a bigger scheme, like as of 2020, beside, okay, let's put Corona aside, because obviously that's the topic worldwide. So what specific changes do you see in the UK right now, to UK radio?
You've mentioned consolidation, and of course that's happened. We've had probably one of the final throws in the consolidation dice up until now, whether we'll have an international player, a new international player buying any of the big radio groups in the UK, who knows? But certainly we've had one of the last big plays in the consolidation battle. We've had a lot of brand rollout, a lot of radio stations being acquired and being branded the same way to sell them and market them nationally. That's been a big trend. Platform changes. Obviously, we've had the move to DAB, which is, that started in the 90s, and we're, up there into significant, 60% penetration for DAB, moving now gently to DAB+, which means yet again around the world. I mean, here I get the feeling that actually it is changing. A lot of local stations ruled their markets for years because they were the only guys in town playing decent music. They just happened to be local. And now many of them being acquired, not as local as they are. And there's this dilemma now as to, if we're going to have local radio, first of all, is there a value in local radio? And if there is, how do we provide it? Is it the public sector? Is it the community sector? Or is it small scale commercial radio stations? Or is it these online radio stations? Or another idea, dedicated podcasts for each market. Some of these are happening now, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a significant business in the UK and in other countries where, cities have their own dedicated podcast. It's well branded, well marketed. You go to a city, you know where to go, and that becomes a significant medium. So I think the future of local radio, knowing how expensive it can be to deliver, is an interesting place in our country, as it probably is elsewhere as well. The BBC, of course, again, this will resonate with other markets with significant public service broadcasters, is in a bit of a dilemma. They're agonizing about impartiality. They're agonizing about younger consumers, because younger consumers aren't going to be customers of the public service broadcaster to the same extent. And so the BBC needs to continue to prove itself, and budgets being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So that's a dilemma of the BBC. What business is it in, and how does it continue to deliver economically? As a battle with government thinking about that, but that's nothing new. I mean, the BBC has battled with government since the 1920s, going back to history. So the BBC has got a new director general, and we're expecting some new direction there. And they clearly launched their Sounds app just a few years ago, putting all their radio operations and their podcasts and just their historic audio in a single place where you could find it, no matter whether you were traditionally a BBC customer or not. No matter which of their brands you consume, you should be able to find audio that they have. So that was the dream, and I think that is still evolving, but clearly attracting huge numbers. And I guess the other thing that's happening in UK radio at the moment is we don't have any audience figures. And if your last set of figures from the beginning of this year were great, it's been your luckiest year ever. You've been trading off those for getting on for a year. But if you had a duff set in March of this year, then you've been carrying those because of COVID. We just haven't been able to do any more door knocking. Radio just hasn't been able to do that. So that's been a real challenge for the industry, and we need to get some more figures pretty soon. But having said that, Radar are doing their best, and they've certainly been doing some very interesting work on listening habits during lockdown. And I think, again, those sorts of reports are popping up around the world too.
Quick follow-up here. You mentioned local radio, which is a big topic, like I think everywhere. So do you think local radio can be financially sustainable in the form? I mean, it's a broad question, but I mean, that's a big topic here. And obviously, like in Germany, the regulations is very different from everywhere else in the world. But can local radio be financial sustainable under that circumstance, in your opinion? Or you see that more like what you said, Brandon, podcast, different delivery options? Is that something that seems more realistic to you?
I think there are two questions. One is there a value in local radio? And the second is, if there is, how do we provide it? In terms of is there a value, all the research I've ever done suggests that, in the bigger markets, in a lot of places, it'd be interesting to see how this is around the world, but people aren't so wedded to localness. There are lots of local stations, but the majority of listeners are choosing to listen to national brands, actually. So in the bigger areas, local radio stations are really suffering. In the smaller areas, they can do pretty well. So I think it depends on the size of the market. I think the move will be to hyper-local radio. So that's the appetite and how it will be fulfilled. In terms of funding it, the great thing about today is you can do it so cheaply. You do not need a building and 30 staff to deliver some great local content. So I think they will be different models, and rather like press, where you see the big press owners just looking at all their graphs doing that because they're trying to run a new world business on old world values, in old world premises, on old world overheads. You're actually finding small local press titles now popping up in little towns and actually doing very well. So I think with a different model, local can do well, particularly in smaller markets.
So David, so far we talked about how we see, or you see, radio changing over the next 5 years, how it's changing presently in the UK. So if we broaden the conversation to now include the audio space, obviously that's brought new platforms, new audio options, resulting in changing consumer behavior. How do all these choices affect radio, and what can we do about Spotify and Pandora, Apple Music, and all these other things that are now available to consumers?
As I said at the outset, I'm incredibly excited about this. We now have the biggest audio supermarket there has ever been. You get now your radio is delivered to your door when you want it. That's incredibly exciting, and lots of career opportunities for a lot of people, but those careers won't look anything like the careers we have been. No limits to consumption. There are no barriers to entry, really. Anybody can be a radio player. But what's going to mark you out as a big player? It's going to be the strength of your brand and the strength of the talents, the personalities you have on your brand. Those are the things that will mark you out. You used to be able to become a big name in radio purely by getting a gig on a big station with a big aerial. That was as complicated as it got. Some of the performers on those brands, as we well know, were earth-shatteringly good, and others weren't. They just happened to be on a big radio station, probably had a great life and a great living out of it, but they were just very lucky. I think now it's much more meritocratic, and you have to earn your place in the media world. You no longer just get a single gig and you're made. So we have to earn our place and find our reputation, market ourselves well, and get known. But I think the future will be owned by the biggest brands and the biggest personalities. You hinted earlier on as well about more niche broadcasting, and that's happened in a lot of other sectors, hasn't it? And as radio and audio becomes internationalized, as television has, then the niches across the world can be actually quite large, and I think people will attract niches. I know we've got Paul Chandler listening in from the UK. He set up a radio station for builders, tradesmen, builders. That would have been unthinkable a generation ago. So we're going to have more successful niches. Lazy radio will be out, I can tell you that. People who don't know what they are doing, who do not focus on delivering the best possible audio entertainment, they will fail. They'll no longer get an audience by default. They'll have to earn it. Single stations probably won't have the dominance they once had, but we will have families of stations, and you're seeing that in a lot of markets around the world now, where you're getting a brand and spin-offs doing various different things, happening in France, happening in Britain, happening across much of Europe, because I guess they are thinking, when my audience is wanting 70s music on a Saturday night, I want them to call for it on our brand, not on Apple Music. So there's this trend to creating these offshoots. But I always finish when I talk about the future by saying, there's one thing that's for sure, in that whatever changes in this incredible world of ours, whatever technology, whoever's delivering it, the thing is, people will always have two ears, and they will always want stuff to put in it. That's not going to change. What we've got to work out is how to deliver it and how to win the battles for the audience. So, as I say, new careers, and they will look, I think, very different from the careers of yesterday.
Okay, I mean, you kind of answered a little bit like the first part of my next question. So the consumers obviously is going to behave differently and already do that, right? So they're going to do that even more. So why do you think there's a big chance, and let's broaden that up and let's say, because in your book, you also talk a lot about podcasts and audio. So why do you think there's a big chance for audio in this change of behavior overall? I mean, of course, I get the feeling voice is a point where you were aiming at before, but where do you feel are those chances specifically for radio or for audio with that change of behavior?
Yeah, I think the best way of maybe looking at that is looking at what radio delivers, that connection that radio delivers, and many people say, how are we going to win the battle against music streaming? How are we going to win the battle against podcasting? And I've always been a believer in saying it's just stuff. It's just stuff that goes in people's ears, and which business you choose to define yourself is your fault in a second, in a way. Clearly music streaming is growing, but again, let's put it in perspective. And it's probably about 14% in the UK, about 40% of all listening. But if you look at 15 to 24s, it's a significant proportion of their listening. Then again, 50 to 24s have always searched out music in different ways. We just never had nice pie charts to demonstrate what it was like a generation ago. So we know that music streaming is going to be a popular option for many people. And so how can radio actually continue to provide something useful? And it is that personality, it is that curation of music, it is that feel good. Radio, whenever you do audience research about radio, the most popular response is, I listen because it fills the room, it's a friend, it makes me feel better. So the contribution the presenter can make, and that may just be 15 words, but they've got to be the right 15 words to make that mix of music sound better than one generated by an algorithm. And that comes on to, the art of the tight link, doesn't it? And so many people say, don't they, radio's, there's no personality anymore in radio. It's all very short links. Well, you can do a lot with a very short link. In my book, Radio Secrets, I talk about the fact that the declaration of war was something like 24 words long, but it was a pretty powerful link, wasn't it, the declaration of war? So you can do a lot in a very short number of words. The other example I give is when you go for a job interview and you get turned down and they call you with some feedback and they make a few comments about what's wrong with you, and you will labor on those words, the particular words that depress you. You will talk about them to friends. You remember them. They said I was, so you just realize the incredible power of single words. So when you are doing a short link, actually agonizing about what do I want to achieve here? How am I going to achieve it? And also, like in the book, I talk about, getting in and out of tight links, the most dangerous part of any airline journey, if ever we were allowed to make them, is takeoff and landing. Those are the two most dangerous things. And the same is true about those short links, isn't it? And long links for that matter. How are you going to start the link? How are you going to get out of it? Working all those things out. So I think, if we are good at that, then radio will continue to thrive. And it is about the words. It's also about the rhythm and pausing for the drum beats and actually just making what you contribute really enhance, the icing on the cake of those great songs. And also the value of the human being in other formats will be the curation, somebody to introduce me to the songs. And to quote one person I was speaking to recently, to make me feel that I can do nothing better with the next 3 minutes of my life, or 3.5 minutes, than to listen to the next song. So all these things I think that we as radio practitioners have to make sure we excel at to continue to attract audiences to our particular sort of audio entertainment.
Well, David, I was going to ask you about what radio needs to do to win against music streaming, but it sounds like you just answered that in a great way. So I'm going to move on. And you've mentioned one of your books that I have right here, but you've written really several excellent books about radio. And the latest here, Radio Secrets, really should be required reading for anyone in music radio, and you get them on Amazon. But in this book, you devoted an entire chapter to what seems to be a buzzword in radio, authenticity. Tell us why.
I think years ago, radio presenters were very rare. And, you wore a silk jacket, you went on stage and people wanted your autograph and wow, you were a star, you were inaccessible. But now, that's not the way, is it? It's about being a real human being on the radio, and it's that human connection. You've got to like the person on the radio. You wouldn't spend 3 hours of your day with somebody you dislike. So you've got to like them, haven't you? That's the first thing. And if you like somebody, you can't like them if you don't know them. And you don't know them unless they give off something about who they are. You have to feel you know them. And that can be in a number of different ways, even on the BBC, where they are limited in terms of what they can say, what they can't say, impartiality. You still, of the great presenters, you still get a feeling that you know the person beyond the radio voice. So I think that's really important. There's a lovely quote in my book, not from me, but from somebody much better, somebody called Anna Rayburn. And Anna was, I'm trying to remember what you call them in America. Agony aunts is what we call them in Britain, but used to do like a problem page on radio. And Anna put it this way. She says, broadcasting is the opposite of acted performance. It's not anything I'm going to put on top of what I am. It is something I'm going to bring out from what is in me. So in other words, in being authentic, we're not asking you to pretend to be something else. We're saying there's something inside you in the words you say, because that's all you've got in radio. In the words you say, how do you get that character out so people feel that they know you? And to quote another person in my book, the people who give of themselves will be remembered far beyond those who don't. And here we are, Simon Sinek, author and motivational speaker. We trust those with whom we're able to perceive common values or beliefs. So all these things point to being yourself on radio. It's difficult sometimes to do it. And people say to me, hang on a minute, I don't want to, a woman said to me the other day, she said, I don't want to be the person on the air. And people always say she's always going on about her kids on air. And I said, no, it's not like that. They'll only say that if you're boring. That's the first thing. But also there are ways, aren't there? There there are techniques of talking about yourself, and it's being generous in conversation. It's starting off anecdotes with devices like, you know what it's like when you go in the supermarket and you walk down the aisle and you do this. This happened to me the other day. So you talk about the listener first, and then you talk about yourself, and you give of yourself. So by the end of a show, by the end of a week, people are starting to get a little bit of idea about you. And once they know you, they're more likely to come back next week. And that's what you need in an increasingly competitive world.
Okay. Wow. So before we take some questions from our viewers, I mean, podcasting obviously is more than a buzzword, and it's a big part of your books as well. So how can radio use podcasting to drive the station ahead?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it's always interesting, isn't it, with podcasts, because they're so easy to do. Anyone can make a podcast.
Exactly. So is there a connection between radio and podcasting, right? Between radio stations basically delivering in what is a new medium. It's just audio as well, but it's still different than the regular program schedule. So is there a chance you seeing for radio stations to participate in that field successfully?
Yeah, very much so. I think the point I was trying to make was, really, it is too easy to make a podcast. Morning crews are thinking to themselves, we must do a podcast. You've got to say, why? What's it for? What's the goal? What's the objective? What is it going to be about? How are we going to do it? And also, although it's so easy to make a podcast, there's also, although it may not cost you anything as a radio station, there's an opportunity cost. And I've seen many teams laboring over a podcast that they've only got 17 subscribers to, and forgetting their 8 o'clock hour tomorrow that they've got thousands of listeners to. So there is an opportunity cost. You've got to make sure that your efforts in the podcasting field are worthwhile. As I say, what's it for? If you want to drive reach, doing a best of podcast or whatever, or something that's much like your radio show that all your listeners are going to download, feels good, but it doesn't actually take you any further, does it? So what if your idea is to grow reach, then do you start a podcast which is in a complementary field to your radio show, maybe something that echoes the brand, or a feature within it, or something else that lives alone? Even if I don't listen to your radio show or your radio station, here's a bit of entertainment which has real value, which I think can get out there. Now that has value, because that will attract an audience that then can learn about you, learn about the radio station, and therefore want to spend more time with you and go back into radio. But there's any point in doing that if that podcast is actually going to spin off and get new people listening. One of the great things about podcasting currently too is it's very sexy, isn't it? And you can get all sorts of people to write articles about new podcasts. They won't write about radio stations with millions of listeners, but they will write about a brave new podcast. So actually, if you can get this new podcast out, which may not even have your radio station brand all over it, sometimes actually you want to set it aside as a bit of entertainment. They'll get to know you soon enough and find you elsewhere once they know about you. But it's about coming up with something that you've got to create a podcast that in isolation is worth listening to. It's really a good idea just to do a spin-off of what you already do. There are exceptions around the world for what I've just said, but I think if you're thinking about growing your audience, actually cultivating a new platform, a new marketing platform for yourself via the podcast through distinctive unsubstitutable content, that's the way forward, and that's where you should put your efforts, I think.
All right, David. Outstanding. We're already at the 30-minute mark, so I hope you can stay a few minutes longer, because we would like to take some questions from our viewers. Does that work for you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so if you're watching now, you have a question for David, feel free to type it in. And while people put some questions in here, why don't you just tell us about your books here and how people can get them?
That's a very nice question. We like questions like that. Can I just say, anyone who's written a book, and I know a lot of people watching will have written books, it's no way to get rich. I mean, we know radio, you don't get rich in radio. You certainly don't get. Do you know the cut authors get for books? It's ridiculous. So buy my books. These won't pay my mortgage. It's just, when you people ask you questions over and over again, and you think, actually, I just want to write these things down. That's what I did in the first book, How to Make Great Radio. That's sort of the golden rules, the basics of radio. And then I got bored and I wrote another one, and this is Radio Secrets. But for this one, I talked to a lot of the practitioners of radio, people I respect greatly to get quotes from them, to get insight from them, to make sure that this contains the very latest up-to-date thinking in what is a fast-changing industry. And what I also did, and this sort of only happened in the course of the book, is I looked outside radio too, to talk to comedians, other people who use language, these sorts of people, to see what we can learn from other sectors in our increasingly competitive radio age. Because, as I said, you've got to be good to survive.
All right, let's go to some questions. First up comes from Ross Winters in Canada. Do you see the physical radio station looking a lot different in the future?
Oh, what a great, I like that question, Ross, sorry, my eyesight here. Yes, it will. You know, we've had the sovereign building, haven't we? You know, you had a radio station, you had a big building on the high street with a neon sign outside, reception area, giving away baseball hats. You know, that was the radio station. And actually, for the last few years, you haven't needed all of that. Really, have you? We've known for a long time you can do it, a lot of it remotely. And COVID has produced, I'm sure, around the world as well, a lot of people operating from their back bedrooms and producing excellent content, you know. And the equipment, of course, is so much cheaper now. So I think the physical radio station, there, you know, you might need a head office or whatever, but I don't think you will need the suites of studios that radio stations have had. We will put the effort into actually what comes out the loudspeaker. You know, if you're starting a radio station, you would have spent so much time, wouldn't you, looking at the floor plans, working out all the physicals. You don't have to do that now. You know, all you need to do is hire the great talent and tell them to put the fader up. That's radio. Actually, we concentrate on the bit that makes it special.
Yeah, Peter Boswell says, do you have any advice for someone trying to progress from hospital radio to something more national?
Yeah, I think increasingly now it's a case of building brand you, isn't it? You've got to set yourself apart by making sure that you are noticed. And you can do that with podcasts, with YouTube, loads of different platforms now where you can demonstrate what you do and who you are. So make sure those are in tip-top condition, showing your very best work. Make sure your social media is interesting. You know, if I'm hiring somebody that I want to entertain people 3 hours a day, I'll scroll through their social media feed. If their Twitter feed's boring, you know, I'm not going to hire them to go out with the great lines tomorrow on the breakfast show. You know, so making sure that everything that's around that represents who you are is in tip-top position, and then it's just the same as it always was. It's trying to get to know people and getting through the door, whether it's a virtual door or a physical door, and that's what it's about. And I know that it can seem, you know, all of us once upon a time didn't have a job in radio, and all of us thought it was beyond reach, and all of us thought we'll never do it, and being in radio was something other people did, but you weren't special enough. If you are good, I can guarantee, if you are good, if you are funny, if you're entertaining, if you're interesting, there are radio stations, there are audio organizations still desperate for you. You've just got to make yourself noticed. And also, on the way up, just be good, be normal, be good to the people around you, think about other people, because when you're going up through the ranks, if you've got a choice between someone who's awkward and good, awkward and promising, and not awkward and promising, you know, the second person gets the gig. So look after how you behave as well.
So Peter, I think that's good advice for Peter. So Peter, if we see you on national radio, David Lloyd's going to be the guy you send flowers to for that.
All right, next one comes from Kieran McGeary. Will the interruption to face-to-face research caused by COVID forces the likes of Radar, which is the rating system in the UK, or JNLR, the rating system in Ireland, to move to alternative methods that are less subject to interruption?
Yeah, I think that will happen. As you said, in a few markets around the world, we rely on, you know, door-to-door research, recruiting of respondents and giving them either a paper diary, or more commonly these days, you know, their diary is online, but the initial contact is through the door. And that's, you know, that's a very expensive, you know, people say, isn't that primitive? That's a very expensive, very good way of doing it, you know, and there are radio markets spending a lot of money on doing that because we want the very best currency, all done with the best intentions. But I think my experience of particularly city markets is it has been increasingly difficult to go out there, and this is before COVID, go out there, knock on doors, and get people to invite you into their home for a stranger into your home for 15 minutes. That's a big ask. I went out actually on one door-to-door knocking survey with Radar to find out how difficult it is. These researchers are brilliant at what they do, but it's a challenge getting through doors, particularly in inner cities. So I think the currency was beginning probably to ask questions of, okay, what can we do that's different? How can we move to an online currency? But in doing that, if we're going to make a change, how can we make sure actually that the figures aren't chalk and cheese? Because different methodologies produce different figures, and markets don't like figures that jump up and down. They don't believe the explanations. So some difficult decisions for Radar at that time. But I think inevitably this is going to lead to doing recruiting online. I suspect it may be a blended way of doing it, and they may post diaries out to people who want a diary post out. They'll do it in a clever way, I'm sure. But I suspect in markets that are still using door-to-door research, that this will be the start of moving to online research, which is, as we know, the foundation for just about every other bit of research you can think of.
Wow, I mean, the questions coming in here, I tell you, we're sitting here another hour, so I don't know who want to prioritize those, but those are all great. Ken, I would pick one, and I don't know how much time, David, you have left. I think there's a couple of really interesting ones. So, Margaret Mary Lim, for example, I think that could be a shorter one to answer, David. Question for David: do you think a daily Facebook Live or radio show is an overkill? In your opinion, do listeners want to watch a radio show versus listening to it? I think that's a good thing, because we talked about audio all the time. So how do you see the visual aspect of audio being important in the future? I think that's what Margaret tries to ask with that Facebook example.
Yeah, visualizations are clearly a big thing, and you can see quite a few of the radio stations now looking very good on screen. When you look back to stuff we did 5 years ago, you cringe, don't you? You think, whoa! People are now there looking. I mean, look at me. I've got a backdrop here. People are, which I've just damaged, I think. People are actually spending more time in what they look like, and we've got to accept that we are alongside every other piece of entertainment. When people flick through their social media, they want to see faces. So I think, yes, looking after how you look is really important, and if you can deliver something visually as well as audio, why would you not want to do that? But making sure that you are still serving your biggest audience well. It's no good suddenly turning into a TV show if 90% of people are only still listening to you. You've got to acknowledge that in how you deliver what you deliver. So I think with care, as always, you should be wherever you can be, wherever the audiences are. You should go, whatever the audiences want, you should follow them where they're of appreciable sizes that are useful to you.
David, do you want to take a few more?
I'll do. I'm in your hands. It's the evening here. I'm off.
Okay, perfect. All right. Scott Williams writes, should we consider radio brand extension music streams as rivals to Spotify in effect, and use the power of our brand as curators?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see many of the radio brands around the world doing this already, can't you? Because, we know what the future looks like. The future will be like this. You'll walk in a room, the smart speaker will no longer look like a smart speaker. It'll just be there. You'll walk in a room and you will say a brand, a person, and the audio will come in. That's going to be the world we are in. And therefore, as a radio brand, if you don't want to lose your audience to, other streaming services, then you'll create well-branded, well-known, perfect streams of whatever your audience want to listen to. And they will be increasingly fragmented.
I think the next question, and ties really nice in here from Stephen Werner. How do you avoid the risk of moving content to digital streams to gain audience, reach a new audience without cannibalizing traditional station models? Do you keep your digital audio offering, not only on podcasts, unique and under an alternative brand rather than existing brand extensions? And I think in a more sentence, he basically specifies that to station revenue models. So how do you feel is the moving content to digital cannibalizing? I think that's the gist of it, cannibalizing the traditional model of creating revenue and market share.
Yeah, are people, is time being lost to radio that's going to other places? Well, probably it is. Yeah. That's the reality of it. If I'm listening to a show on demand, I'm not listening to it live. We've just got to make sure we are monetizing everything and accounting for everything. And going back to Kieran's question about audience research, the other thing that we've got to watch is, we probably are moving to a world where we can't just monitor radio. I think as a radio programmer, you want to know what's happening at 10 o'clock. If people are going to music streams, what are they going to and how? So, the measurement of radio has to change to recognize these changing habits. In terms of cannibalizing revenues, podcasts are very hot. You go to an ad agency, they're really hot for podcasting, and sometimes actually selling a podcast and a package around that can be easier than selling sponsorship of a radio program.
So you see it more as an upgrade. You see it more as an upgrade to the revenue model than like a downgrade, right?
I think it is a useful, sexy adjunct to the person who's going out selling audio. They've got something else to sell, and salespeople love new things to sell.
So we began the webinar today talking about the future and where radio is going to be in 2025. So we have a question from Philippe, and I won't try and pronounce his last name because I will not get it right. But anyhow, David, do you believe in a future where great radio personalities don't need the brand of a radio station, but distribute on demand their content and show?
Absolutely. I believe that's the future. As I said earlier on, I think the future is in the hands of the big brands and the big personalities, and I do think that some of the biggest names in radio, in audio, why will you, we know that audio is going to move from broadcast to IP, and you can set up your own station, stream, call it what you want, and you don't need a radio station. And I'm sure you could do that now if you had a few aerials and some marketing budget. But yeah, I think we are moving to that world most definitely.
Yeah.
In news as well as entertainment, I think think of your best known newsreader, and I'm just trying to think of the best example here. You tell me the news. Name the newsreader and tell me the news. That's a very logical instruction for a smart speaker, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Joe Rogan's another perfect example of that, right? He's never been on radio. Spotify paid him, $100 million?
Yeah. I mean, even Howard Stern moving to Sirius back in the day. I mean, Howard Stern proved that like 15, 20 years ago, like by creating Sirius, that like a powerful content creator can pull audience. I mean, in the podcast world, we see that every day. I mean,
totally agree.
All right, so let's take one more question, if that's okay with you, from Sammy Simpson. What is the key ingredient for producing powerful content?
The key ingredient. This requires a single answer, doesn't it? Okay. Think of the listener. Think of the listener. Who is this for? Because everything flows from that. Every single answer to every single question flows from, who do I want to listen to this? Whether it's a podcast, whether it's a radio program. Who's the listener? That's the answer.
Well, thank you, David. This has been really an incredible and valuable 45 minutes. So we thank you so much for being on here. We thank all you guys for viewing today from around the world. It's been incredible, from Saudi Arabia to South Africa to the Caribbean and the U.S. and all over Europe. It's been amazing. Even Singapore I saw popped up on the screen. So you've drawn a worldwide audience, and we appreciate having you on. Of course, on the screen, you can see the information for David's latest book, where he's got a brand new one coming, but his latest is Radio Secrets. That and others are available at Amazon.com. And I own them both. I suggest you do too. They're really worthwhile and beneficial reads. And you can tell today from David's knowledge, he's an incredibly insightful radio professional with so much to share. And he's so eager to share it to make radio better. So we appreciate having you on. Our next.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I was just interrupting your tease, didn't I? I shouldn't do that. Andy, Ken, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure.
And you weren't, if you didn't get your question answered and you want to drop me a line by email, please feel free. Thank you.
That would have been my next question, if you would allow people to reach out, because I have plenty of more questions, like in terms of like, what is the best way of promoting my own podcast and so on and so on. So guys, feel free to drop David an email. We're responsible for hundreds of questions now, David, and your email may be worth for a new book. Let's see. Coming to our next guest, Mr. Benson. Who's that going to be?
It's going to be morning show ace Tracy Johnson on the 19th of November. So more details will come along in just a couple of weeks. So we hope you can join us for that. Also, if you'd like to rewatch this or share the webinar from today, it'll be posted on P1 and Benztown social channels later on today. So feel free to spread that love. And I think it's absolutely a worthy 45 minutes for anybody in radio to watch. So thanks again, David. Last thing, too, on November 12th, we're going to be doing a special live webinar with Radio Days Europe as we do a virtual award show for the Coronavirus Radio Ideas and honor best ideas from around the world for 12 different categories. And there's some incredible ideas. I know many of you have voted, so we thank you for that. And the awards will be coming on the 12th. More details to come. So on behalf of David Lloyd, Andy in Benztown, I'm Ken Benson from the P1 Media Group. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks, guys. Looking forward to it. Cheers. Bye, Dave.